as I said, Métis land rights are still unsettled in this country, just sort of for some context. There's a lot of these questions that take a really, really, really long time to resolve. So the Métis population of Canada was declared Indians, i.e. sort of Indigenous people, in 2003, but they aren't subject to the Indian Act, again, in that sort of declaration in 2003. So there isn't really a lot of clarity on what that means for Indigenous populations to be Indian but not subject to the Indian Act, which means that they don't have access to sort of the treaty written negotiation pieces that we're going to talk about in a little bit. And this is especially important given the federal government's focus on reserves for this kind of policy, and the fact that without treaties you don't get reserves, and sort of that kind of piece. So this is still unsettled, but it is not the only sort of weird thing that winds up happening in terms of Métis history and sort of the province of Manitoba. Manitoba has another sort of interesting piece. So if you remember, we sort of said in our last video that at the establishment of the province of Manitoba in 1870, there were two departments of education, one of which is Anglophone and Protestant, and the other of which is Francophone and Catholic. Just for context, it's really, really common for pretty much every school division at this point in time to be religious in nature, so it's not weird that there's no like secular one. That idea comes much, much later. So what's important in terms of in 1870 is that you have two of them. You have one that recognizes sort of Francophone Catholic rights and one that recognizes sort of Anglophone Protestant rights. And there isn't a lot of conversation about, well, what do you do with Anglophone Catholics and what do you do with Francophone Protestants? That's not what happens. This is sort of a division, and it recognizes those sorts of minority language and cultural rights because, by and large, the Francophone population is Catholic and the Catholic population is Francophone. Okay? So by about 1880, 1890, which is sort of only like 20 years after the foundation of the province, a lot of the population, the Métis population of Manitoba have moved west. They've moved further west in search of being able to preserve their way of life. So they're looking to sort of still have herds of bison, that kind of thing. Okay, and at this point in time, remember, almost all of the Anglophone Protestant politicians who are running Ottawa at this point in time are really interested in reproducing a British nation. So almost all of the immigration that they are encouraging is from people who are Anglophone and Protestant. And as those Anglophone Protestants are running out of like good farmland, sort of in the eastern part of the province, in the Maritimes, in Ontario and Quebec, they're moving further west, right? Which means eventually they get to Manitoba. And that sort of means that the demographics of Manitoba are changing and that it is now no longer kind of like a fully Métis province. There's this sort of substantial Anglophone population. And that sort of leads to a number of changes because remember that Anglophone population is still really interested in pursuing the kind of homogeneity of having one culture, one language, one religious sort of tradition. The idea really is to create a population that is pretty homogenous and to sort of stamp out all of the minority cultures and languages. So in 1890, French is abolished as an official language of Manitoba, so it lasts all of 20 years as an official language of Manitoba. And it makes the Protestant Board of Education the only one that is available. This sort of means that you have the Protestant school board running both Francophone Protestant education and Anglophone Protestant education. So you can do that. You can still get a Francophone education, but if you want to get a Catholic education, you have to pay out of pocket. And what this practically means is you have groups of of parents who are, coming together to pay a teacher or a priest to educate their children, like they're basically having to run their own school boards because the only one that's available is not going to give their children the religious education that they think is important. And again, context-wise, remember that at this point, almost all parents want a religious education of some kind for their children. So that's one change in 1890. In 1916, there's another sort of change to the law. Again, there's more Anglophones, more people coming from sort of who speak neither English nor French, but are coming and sort of are encouraged by the Anglophone nature of the government. Only English can be used or taught in Manitoba schools, and if you want Catholic education, it still has to be paid for privately. That sort of means that This is a policy intentionally aimed at eliminating the Francophone culture in Manitoba. That's really, really important. And it leads to a number of questions, right? Um, if you're going to look, okay, technically there are many Métis populations in Canada who speak Michif. But if you're going to talk about what that looks like in terms of a European language, they're much more likely to speak French than they are to speak English. So the inability to get Francophone education is an important piece of setting up what's going on in terms of this sort of recognition, this sort of idea. Um, and that's sort of part of the conversation where there's a perception that the Métis population is, there's an attempt to assimilate it and to sort of force them to become something else and sort of erase their identity. But that experience and those laws sort of passed in Manitoba in 1890 and 1916 are also a big part of why the population of Quebec, by and large, stayed within Quebec for a really long time. So up until probably the 1980s even, if you sort of looked at surveys, Quebec had the highest proportion of people who had never been outside of the province. And one of the reasons they hadn't been outside of the province was that there was a perception that everywhere else in Canada they were going to be sort of subject to this kind of abuse and harassment because, for example, the um, population of Manitoba sort of intentionally decided, oh no, even though the Manitoba Act says we should do this, we're not going to. So there was that sort of creates that fear and that division, especially when you start looking at things like the conscription crisis in the First and Second World War, about that sort of tension between the interests of Francophones and the interests of Anglophones. The Manitoba schools question plays into this a whole lot. And I will sort of say that in 1985, the Supreme Court of Canada declared and decided that these restrictions on Francophone and Catholic education violate the Manitoba Act and that they are therefore unconstitutional. But I am going to point out that that only works after the Charter of Rights and Freedoms because it basically comes down to a statement that by refusing to provide Francophone and Catholic education, the province of Manitoba was denying people who inhabited Manitoba collective language rights and collective cultural rights. So that decision can't be made until those rights are established in the documents and in the charter and that sort of thing. So there's that kind of piece. But I do also want to point out that by 1985, when the Supreme Court of Canada says, actually, guys, you have to do this thing, you've been looking at a solid 95 years of linguistic and cultural suppression for Francophone, Métis, Catholic populations in Manitoba. Any of those three, basically. And many people have more than one. So that changes a lot of things, right? In that if your parents speak French to you at home, but you have to use English when you go to school, then you may not teach your children French when you have children in turn because you know English perfectly well. Why would you bother to teach them French when they can't use it in school and it's going to be an extra challenge for them? There's all of those sorts of challenges and pieces around that. And I don't necessarily want to say that it's impossible, right? There's still a relatively vibrant Francophone community in Manitoba. It's just that in a lot of ways, the Supreme Court decision takes a really long time and that there's a lot of damage done in that time period. This is one of the reasons why, for example, there's a lot of conversations about needing to fix things before they get to the Supreme Court because of those challenges and because of the damage that you can do in that interval. Okay? So that is a very brief introduction to the Manitoba schools question. But I also want to sort of ask you guys to think about that sort of piece, is that when we're talking about the Métis population, there is no real question, and we've got some great examples on the discussion boards, you can take a look at them, that the Métis population of Canada faces a whole lot of oppression, that they are challenged in a lot of ways, they're prevented from accessing a bunch of resources, all of that is true. Is that about language? Is that about indigeneity? Is that about some mixture of both? We don't really know, and there isn't sort of a way to sort of figure that out, partially because there are probably places where that kind of oppression and that kind of additional difficulty comes from both sources. So please be aware that when we start talking about this sort of thing, that we're not dealing with sort of bad things happen to you just because you're Indigenous. It's way more complicated than that, especially when you're dealing with the sort of Métis population that for a long time, we could talk about this in terms of treaty negotiations, are sort of considered to not really fit in anywhere. They don't really fit in with the Indigenous populations for a variety of reasons. And they don't really fit in with the European populations, again, for a variety of reasons. And so in some ways, you have both groups who are trying to push them out of their sort of understanding of what society should look like. So that is a complicated question. I want you guys to sort of be aware that this is not a simple sort of issue. That, I guess, is our discussion of the Manitoba schools question.